give our hearts and our thoughts to Thee. In Jesus' name, amen. The son-in-law of Shepherd came to St. Paul and paid me a visit, invited me to come down to his college in Carrollton, Georgia, and address the student body. And as I was going to be in Chattanooga on a certain date, I said, how can you arrange that? I'd have a few more days. And he said, well, you take a late night train to the town of York, I believe it was, in Georgia, and spend the night there. You get there about 10:30 or 11, and take the bus at 7:30 for Carrollton. And I very happily met all those arrangements. But I went down ahead of time, thought I'd get a little snatch of a breakfast, perhaps at the station, bus station at 7, but they had nothing there. So I asked them when the bus would arrive, and they said about 11:25, and it leaves in 11:30, as you know. And I said, no, I don't want the 11:30. I want the 7:30 bus. Oh, you didn't realize we're on daylight saving. That bus left half an hour ago. Well, the chapel was to be at 10 o'clock. I'd come all the way, you might say, down there, and here I was going to miss the situation. So I phoned to Mr. Kerry Smith, this son-in-law of Shepherd. I had missed the bus and was going to hitchhike, and he'd better have some professor prepared to pinch hit if I didn't get there. I took the city bus outside of the city, and then I stood with my thumb up, and a young man picked me up, and we went merrily onward for a few miles, and then puff, he said, a flat. He got out, and he said, the spare is also flat. So he limped back into the town, and I stood there and stood, and after a while, a little man in a little old Ford stopped and took me in, and we came to a hill and went puff, puff, puff. He said, I don't know whether we can make these hills. The engine's not very strong, and we had nothing but hills. I found his father had fought in the Civil War on the southern side. My father had fought on the northern side, so we had an interesting conversation. He reached that town, and he said, this as far as I go, and unfortunately stopped at the wrong side. I had to walk clear across the town, and again put up my thumb, and no one came. Finally, 9 o'clock came. I saw, here, I've got to make this by 10 o'clock. So I had a conversation with the Lord. I said, now, Lord, I didn't arrange this. You've done the arranging, and it's very likely that there's a much better man to give that talk this morning than I am. But if you want me to get there, you'll have to arrange all the transportation. Having done that, that shifted the responsibility where it belonged, and I stood there in peace of mind, watching the cars go by, and finally a car with an old couple stopped. I said, you're an answer to prayer. The old lady said, we believe in prayer. My husband leads singing in churches everywhere. And after a while, we were riding along, he said, would you like to, have you ever sung, have you seen Jesus? I said, no, but I'd love to hear you sing it. He said, do you want me to sing in bass or tenor? I said, either will suit me. He sang it a part time, I think, in one and one in the other, and his wife had a high falsetto, very cracked voice, and they all joined in, and as we went by the schoolhouses, it's about recess time, I had put down the window, and if they ever heard a calliope going by, this was the calliope. His father had fought in the Civil War on the southern side, so we also had another interesting conversation. We finally reached Buchanan, and I rushed into a telephone booth and said, I'm 20 miles from Carrollton. I'm going to take a taxi, and I'll be there. I'll pass a little bit late. And he said, all right, we just put on an extra song, it'll be okay. And then he turned to the dean and said, he's at Buchanan. He's going to take a taxi. And the dean said, I have lived in Buchanan many years. If he had said that from any other town in Georgia, I'd have believed him. But that's the one town where they have no taxis. I immediately discovered that, and someone said maybe the shoemaker could take you. So I went into the shoemaker's shop. He wasn't sitting at the job like I thought they usually do. He was standing there pounding away. And I said, could you take me to Carrollton? I reckon I can. After I get the mail, I said, when do you get the mail? Oh, I don't get the mail till 11:30. Well, I said, I got to be there at 10 o'clock. And a man sitting by said, there's a man named Mr. Swift, lives 10 miles from here, that he has a little sort of a taxi. And then somebody else said, I think I saw Mr. Swift in the town just a few minutes ago getting in his car. I said, where do you think I could find him? Well, maybe he might be at the post office, so I hurried to block off to the post office. I said, is Mr. Swift in here? And the man came out and he said, that's Mr. Swift down there at the courthouse, going in the courthouse. And so I yelled, Mr. Swift, and he paused until I caught up with him. Could you get me down to Carrollton? I reckon I can after I get a lawyer that I want for a case in here. And he went in and very immediately came out. I said, do you think you could make a mile a minute? We have 20 minutes to go. I had read a poem. I used to recite a poem in my school days about Sheridan, 20 miles away. And he said, I reckon I can if the constable doesn't catch me. I said, was your father in the Civil War on the southern side? He said, no, but both of my uncles were, and they were both killed in Gettysburg, so my grandmother refused to let her youngest son go, and so that was the reason I got a trip to Carrollton. By the way, I'm very much against war, for when I was down at the first camp farthest out in Texas, I discovered, I was telling rather boastfully, how my father was in the last charge of the Civil War. After Lee had surrendered, we charged on Fort Blakely. And Mary Welch, who was the co-leader, said, my grandfather was in there shooting at your father, and her father was a poor shot, my father was a poor shot, so we had a camp farthest out. If they'd been good shots, we wouldn't have been here. Well, meanwhile, the chapel met down at Carrollton. And Mr. Terry Smith stood before the 600 students or 700 students, and they were going to hear another one of these old dry talks of somebody or other, so they were going to get out their textbooks to read, and he said, just a little while ago I got word that our speaker, Glenn Clark, is in Buchanan. He said he's going to take a taxi, and Mrs. Dean says there are no taxis. But Glenn Clark believes in prayer, and I think he'll be here. So I'm going to ask you to sing one extra song, and meanwhile I'll walk out that hall and go out that door. And when I go out that door, I'll expect to see him getting out of a car. As we drove up, I said, how much do you charge? What would the charge be? He said, $3. That'd be less than the bus fare would have been. I said, well, here's $3.50. And I jumped out with my suitcase and started to run, and Carrie Smith said, don't hurry. They're singing Jacob's Ladder. We came walking in, and if the three angels that visited Abraham had come walking in at that time, that audience of young men and women would not have been any more transfixed and absorbed and startled than they did when they saw this man from the south, from the north, who believed in prayer, come walking in. They sat on the edge of their seats, and I talked to them on prayer, and I had a living light to give to them, and I found they were as well prepared as if they'd been to a camp for a week. It cost me less. I'd had some nice conversations with men whose fathers had fought in the Civil War, and the whole thing worked together for good. Now, this is what I'm coming to tell you tonight, carrying out the thought that Ruth mentioned, how that property of hers was sold and things like that. Now, it sounds a little like magic, but I'm going to get ready to explain presently how these things come to pass. Beforehand, I want to tell of another thing. A great many men have wanted me to be on their board of directors. I've been called into 3 different colleges that were very poor, and we prayed, and infinite money has come rolling into them. I can mention 3 of them. One's McAllister, one Bell College, and one's Phillips University. I think if the college presidents only heard of that, if the president of this college were sitting out there, they'd come rushing in, want me to be on the, and I say, I can't spread myself and be on all these boards, but I'll be on your board of spiritual directors. And so there's a man named Ben Johnson, president of a lumber company in California, with an income or salary of $25,000 a year, and always worrying about his old age, whether they'll have money enough to his wife and him. And he never felt his comfort. So he begs me to be on his board of directors, which I said I would be on his spiritual board. Hardly for several years, about every few months, he'd phone me from Texas or wherever he's having a board meeting of some kind, some big transaction, to pray about it. Just a few years ago, I was in King, well, it is the hotel in New York where I always stay. Prince George, I believe. And leading a retreat there in the Norman Vincent Peale's church, and a voice from California. This is Ben Johnson. The doctors have say that I have cancer, and please arrange your journey so you can be out and see me this year sometime. I said, my schedule's all full just to the brim, and I'm sorry I just can't make it, but I'll be praying for you. I'll certainly be praying for you. We talked over the phone. It so happened we to have our first camp farthest out in Hawaii that year. I did rather an unprecedented thing. I found I had a few extra spare days, and Roland and Marcia Brown said, we're going to go by automobile here to the coast. Won't you go with us? We'll take your book, Water of Life, and we're going to read it and discuss it and just live it as we will across the continent. I want to tell you this, folks. If you can ever take a journey with folks that are completely 100% in tune with heaven, living in the kingdom of heaven every morning and tuning in, and take the opportunity just to be with them a while, you'll find it'll be a most marvelous experience. It was a marvelous experience, but when we reached Cheyenne, I said, I've been figuring up our schedule. We're going to get there a little earlier than I anticipated. And we're going to get there the day before we leave. We don't leave until evening in San Francisco. And we won't reach San Francisco that evening, but we'll come to some little town this side of San Francisco. And I know that Ben Johnson lives in a little town this side, some lumbering town, but I don't remember the name of the town. I think it's Stockton because it's a great lumber center, and he's phoned me from there. So I put in a long-distance call, and no Ben Johnson, no Johnson at all in Stockton, as the telephone girl said. And I said, well, then the Lord will have to give us the name. Traveling that way where you're so completely in tune, you can expect miracles. We made 600 miles that day into Nevada, got there by supper time, and I said, I'm this constant travel, and we're just living in the kingdom. I'd like to come down and see something of this world by going to a movie this evening. Only one little movie in that little town, and they had a nice one figured up. Oh, that'll be tomorrow. Oh, it's still a better one, but that's the day after tomorrow. Only thing tonight is roughshod, Western. Well, I said, let's go anyway. 3 pretty girls got on a stagecoach. And the stagecoach was routed for Sonora. Sonora, I said. That's the name of the town where Ben Jonson lives. Of all things, to come into a moving picture show to have the Lord tell you things. And a rough shot of all places. Why, if I go into Sheol, go down to the hill when you're in tune, the scripture says, I'll find God there. Go to a dance hall, you'll find you can't get away from God if you just tune in with Him every morning. Well, I phoned Ben Johnson. We got back about 9:30, about 8:30 in California. His wife said he's just dancing with joy all those 24 hours till we arrived. He never heard of Roland Brown, who had his wonderful healing power, and we prayed with him. Went across Hawaii. He phoned clear across the island. He'd been reading now the book about Roland Brown and wanted to meet us when he came back, which he did, and he took us to our next connection point. And then some months later, he sent a letter. The doctor says he can't understand it, but I'm completely cured of cancer. Now, the way those things fit together, and when I found that the name Sonora coming to me, I said, now I know God's in it. I won't have very much work to do in praying for this man. He wouldn't have brought us there if he weren't going to have some power. Now I'm going to tell you where these things come. They don't come just off like apples thrown on the tree. But 30 years ago, I decided to take Jesus at His word. He said 7 times, He repeated it and repeated it, whatsoever things you ask in my name will be done, and they weren't done. So I said, I'm going to take a year now to studying the only lesson He gave in prayer, which was when they asked Him how to pray, He gave them a little model prayer called the Lord's Prayer. It takes 30 seconds to recite it. It's taken me 30 years to learn how to pray it. And the first year, I didn't try to learn the whole thing. I just said I'm going to concentrate on learning one passage in it. And I selected this. Thy kingdom come, and thy will be done on earth or in earth. I like the in earth. It's the inside, in your consciousness, as it is in heaven. Now, if I'm asking, it's almost in the form of a command. You realize the Lord's Prayer is the only prayer that's formulated in the form of a series of commands and affirmations. Thy kingdom come, on earth as it is in heaven. So every morning I pray that, but in a different way. I would expect as I walked out the door just to be like Alice through the looking glass. I'd walk right out there and find everything in reverse to what it is on this earth. Instead of meeting a man as your enemy that'll lead with the left to your jaw, he'd lead with the right to your hand. I found everything, instead of the proud, the meek shall inherit the earth. I found I had to conform to that new world. I was like learning to walk in a new world. I got reborn. A little baby, when it's born, it has to learn how to walk. And it falls down several times. I found I fell many times. But I'd get up and start again. A man that didn't like me, and he'd said a mean thing, and I was going to say a mean thing back. No, hold on, I'm in the kingdom. I'd go spread nice things about him. I just said, as more he'd talk against me, the more I'd talk for him. I found just by reversing it, pretty soon everything began to, new things began to happen. And I made this discovery. I didn't have to wait to die to discover it. I found I've looked this into reports of folks who have gone over into the other world and come back. One of them is 20 Minutes of Eternity by Margaret Prescott Montague. When she was told, it was the first camp farthest out I ever held in the South. It was Ferrum, Virginia. I don't remember whether Ruth Robinson's there or not. I think were you there? And Louise Eggleston was there, but not as a leader. It was the first thing she's getting into this kind. She was the secretary and went around and arranged the beds and prayed in each room before anyone came. And And there was Margaret Preston Montague, had bad hearing, bad sight, could hardly see, hardly hear. But when she was in the hospital, they said, "You're never going to see again or hear," she just sank back and accepted into the kingdom of heaven. And for 20 minutes, she was in heaven. She said, never realized how extraordinarily beautiful every face was that she could see. How extraordinarily beautiful the bird songs were. How sweet and loving the nurses were. Why, she was just in heaven. Starr Daily, after he'd have been hanging in the cuff for 15 days, stretched out on the cold solitary confinement. Jesus appeared. He had hated for 40 years, for 25 years. If he hated hard enough, he could stand the punishment and the suffering. But he didn't know. He had never loved once. But he'd never seen such love as he saw in the eyes of Jesus. And they drew the heat out of him like poison drawn out of the wound. And he's simply in heaven, in bliss. He didn't know there was such bliss. Gradually the face faded away. And he's told me that someday he's going back to that penitentiary. He's going to ask the warden to let him go into that solitary confinement and be all alone for one night. And just try to recapture that. I discovered this, that when you die and go into heaven, the first thing you're going to discover is that you're going to be with the persons you want to be with when you want to be with them. And that is the moment they'll want to be with you. In the second place, you'll find that ideas will come to you in perfect sequence and perfect order, just the right ideas at the right time. And you'll find in heaven that the supply resides in the need. And as the larger the need, the larger the supply will come. How do I know? Because every day I stepped out expecting the kingdom of heaven. I just expected it every day. And I found the people that I didn't like strangely liking me now, or else they wouldn't meet me. If I was thrown in with anyone, I was in a kingdom state, and I'd find they were there. I had just spent years writing an article for the Atlantic Monthly, put all the knowledge, grammar, and rhetoric I knew into it, sent the Atlantic, and they sent it back, sent to Harper's, and still back. Now a boy asked me how I prayed. Well, I simply prayed the Lord's Prayer, and let's see, how do I pray? I went in, said, Lord, you take hold of this pen, and you answer it, and I'm going to be in the kingdom, and you let the ideas come in perfect sequence and order. And I was amazed. Someone said, why don't you send the Atlantic? And I mailed it, and I knew the Atlantic didn't accept religious articles, but they said send half a dozen more like it. I got letters from the South Pole, from all over the world. One from the South Pole said twice, the bird party's life's been saved because I carried your book lashed to my dog sledge. And it has enabled me to get so in tune with God that ideas had come in sequence and order. One night I see Larry Gould, second in command, the man who accomplished more than all the others that ever went with Admiral Byrd on those expeditions, according to Admiral Byrd. Larry Gould said to the men, get out of your sleeping bags and move over there 100 yards. Something tells me this isn't safe. And oh, how they did grumble. But the next morning there was a chasm down the center of the earth where all of us would have been if it hadn't been that you wrote that book. Ideas coming in sequence and order. Since then, books have been rolling out from me, and the last 7 years I've written a book a year and only have no time to write them, except between 5 and 7 in the morning. And I'm now gone 9 months of the year, and I don't write when I'm on these journeys. I can't explain it, but I want to tell you that if you just take 15 minutes every day, stepping out and expecting to be in the kingdom of heaven, and like I said, we're all angels, but we suffer from amnesia, I meant it. If you step out each day believing that you can start being angels right here in the kingdom, enjoy it right here, don't have to wait until you go into the other room of the kingdom over there, it's amazing. For I have discovered God has made one world, and he's arranged the moving pictures of all the events in it. And if we let him turn them, what would we have? Why, do you know if all the money spent in the Second World War had been spent for constructive purposes, there could have been a 5-room house built for every family in the world, even the Hottentots of South Africa, and those millions lying there sleeping in the streets of India. A 5-room house for every family in the world, and a hospital in every city of over 25,000 inhabitants, subsidized for 10 years. But Stalin said, let me turn the moving picture, and he turned it what? Opposite. And so did Mussolini, and so did Stalin, and so, say, protect me, Lord, said Churchill, and so did Roosevelt. A great big ego saying, I can do this thing, I can do it. I'm the only one that could be reelected 4 times. Let me run the thing. I know how to do it. Let me be there at Yalta. The strength of Eisenhower has been that he knew he didn't know anything unless he had prayer all the way. And before he left, his wife wrote to the Camp Farthest Out, begging us to have all the prayer groups praying for them. And and I want to say that if we just let the Lord turn the moving picture, what is the opposite of love? Why, it's hate, isn't it? What's the opposite of peace? The Lord's reign is the thing of peace. Turn it just the opposite way, it's war. Oh, it's as simple as that. Instead of leading with the left, just do the reverse and shake hands. And so I began doing things just the opposite. And here I was a coach of a track team. And I went out there and had my boys, a bunch of sissies, you'll say. They didn't swear or do anything until, and even when the other team couldn't find the right kind of referee, they would say, well, Professor Clark, we know you're honest. Would you be willing to referee this game in which your boys are going to participate? Well, they knew, and my boys knew that in case of doubt, I'd give to the other side. And the other side is the head and the half. But I said, boys, that's up to you now to prove your mettle. And they went in and won. And after we began to win everything, after a while, they didn't think we were a sissy. They didn't think it was a sissy. And I got into my Bible writing class until the president even called me in and said, the Bible department is getting restless. They say that they're supposed to have a monopoly of the Bible, the religion, and they say you're putting more religion into your writing class. And I said, then they are. And I said, well, we've gotten more stories and poems in the national student anthologies than any college in America. And so, doing just the opposite, I found was one of the ways to live in the kingdom of heaven. Always forgive your enemy. Do all, give the other. I began to give away my money, and the more I gave it away, the more it came rolling in. And so I just found that that living in the kingdom, pray it in the morning and then step out on it. Riding down here, I stopped at the place where I was born. Some friends driving me had brought a special rock because that tenement house where I was born had been taken down as a vacant lot. So we planted that birthstone. I believe in marking your birthplaces rather than your death places. These gravestones, I'm through with them. But the hospital where my 3 children were born was burned down, so I took my 3 children, we put some nice birthstones where they were born, and it rather embarrassed them when their friends found they were born in a vacant lot up there. But I told of an incident. When I was in that, I call it the brick row there, when I was 4 years of age, my mother was telling a story, and I was in heaven. Right ideas at the right time, with the person you wanted to be with, and you wanted to be with her. And Mrs. Beaner came in, and she lived at the end of this block, And no one liked Mrs. Beener, especially little boys. Her name fitted her as perfectly as if Dickens had given it to her. When she came to leave, Mother felt she hadn't been very cordial, so she wanted to make amends, and she said, well, do you have to hurry away? Why don't you stay a little longer? Well, if you insist. Then I discovered that hell is to be with a person you don't want to be with when she doesn't want to be with you. For years, I was born there, 73 years ago, and they always wanted to tear down. The last 50 years they wanted to tear down that, but Mrs. Beener refused. And we found Mrs. Beener's end of the thing still sticks up like a sore thumb. And the new building is up there, but they didn't overlap the vacant lot where I was born. So we have that gravestone. And someday, when I get to be famous, maybe they'll take a picture of that birthstone. At any rate, when I went to college, I saw a beautiful girl, very charming girl, come into the chapel. And I'd come partly to college to get an education and partly to pick out just the right mate. I had studied phrenology, so I could tell people's character by the bumps on their heads. I can tell the character of every Irishman's wife by the bumps on his head. Well, here is a young lady. She's blonde, and I was brunette. I said, now the chief thing was she had a sweet quality that I could fall in love with. She had long fingers. That meant she'd be good at details, and she'd save that off my hands. I had short fingers. I didn't care for details. I used to hurry there, and I'm just kind of talking because there's other things I was looking at besides the fingers and blah. But I didn't get courage up enough to introduce myself. But I joined the literary society of the boys, which later decided to give a party to the girls' sister society. They had a unique way of pairing off. I recommend this to you young men and women. They put a list of all the girls' names on the blackboard, and then we drew numbers. The one that drew number 1 could scratch out his choice. I maneuvered to get number 1. I crossed out the name of Louise Miles. Oh, how that name does sound like poetry. I found where she lived. The next evening, I walked around the block 5 times, and then I did a deed that deserves to rank with the exploits of Horatio at the bridge, Charlotte Corday, and the charge of the Light Brigade. I went up and I rang the bell. She let me in person, took me to the parlor. I twisted my hat and got out what I came for, and then she just stared at me. She'd never seen me before. She finally accepted. She's on the way to get the party. I wanted to go with her. She didn't seem very anxious to go with me. That wasn't exactly heaven. That wasn't exactly hell. That was just purgatory. But after I graduated, then taken a year at Harvard and cycled through Europe, I came to that same house. She had graduated. It's now a beautiful summer. We walked across the beautiful campus under the elms, and there I made a great discovery. Midsummer night, 24th of June, that I wanted to be with her, and she wanted to be with me, and that was heaven, and we've been in heaven ever since. After 30 years of happy married life, she actually stepped through the thin partition that separates us from heaven, from this earth, and but because we've been living in heaven, the shock was not so great. And on these journeys, I can always feel almost closer to her than if she's back home, darning stockings or something. When I really need help, I'll just say, Louise, you're a little nearer the throne than I am. You just talk to the Lord about this and just open up the windows of heaven and let the power of the Spirit flow through. Yes, it's been wonderful. Well, heaven. But then when I wanted to be with someone, here I wanted to be with Ben Johnson. Here I was, and I got there. Dr. Carver wanted to see me. I went to see him, and my beloved friend. You came the wrong day of Saturday noon here. All afternoon Saturday and all day Sunday, my infantile paralysis victims come. And and all day Sunday, can't you wait till Monday? I said, no, I have to speak in Atlanta tomorrow. But I'm going to lunch with my friend here, and we'll come back after lunch. And I said to him, I know it's going to rain. They always come, he said, unless it rains. If it rains, I tell them not to come. Why, it doesn't look like it. I said, I know it's going to rain. Now, there's sometimes I'm emphatic. Shouldn't always I know things, but I started the day in the heaven. I knew that he always would go out and talk to dear Mr. Creator before breakfast at 4 o'clock. And when the Creator and the heaven meet together, this always works out. And it rained so hard we could hardly get out of a car. The only ones came. There were 4 or 5 people that had arranged to come for a little meeting with us. They came. There's someone out here that knows some of those folks. Put your hand up. Who is it? Yes, you told about this woman, that family they brought, and they brought this woman from Florida. They arrived, and we sat there in his little work, in his God's little workshop, and I went in alone, and we prayed. And after that, he said his discoveries, his inventions came twice as fast ever since I prayed with him in that. And all my books and things came twice as fast after I prayed with him. And they began there the deepest spiritual friendship, I think, in the world from that time forth. A black man from the south, a white man from the north. He was born a slave. My father fought to free the slaves. And here we were. He was a scientist, I was a teacher of literature, but we both had a God, the common God that we knew could answer prayer. Neither of us were priests or preachers, but I want to say there's a fellowship and a friendship that I'll never forget. And I put it into a little booklet, the story of that conversation. 300,000 copies of that have gone out, and every week or month I get letters from people from all over the world whose lives have been changed by reading about Dr. George Washington Carver. The next day, Sunday, all his infantile paralysis victims came, and it was all right. And so those things went perfectly. On these journeys across the continent, I found I had become a sort of an unconscious imitator of a white-haired man whom I have described in 2 of my books, who walked through the train one day and asked if he could sit beside me. He said, on every trip I make across the continent, I tell my story to one person. And the Lord tells me whom I'm to tell it to, and will you be willing to let me tell it to you? I said, I'll be glad to. That was in 1909 on my journey to home to get married. And since then, I have made similar experiences. And it so happened that about 25 years ago, I was on the boat going from Boston to Portland, Maine, and I said, I haven't told my story to anyone. I went down to the heat of the dining salon, and there are 4 people at each table. 2 of the men were strangely silent, but the other one was just strangely talkative. And he said, have you ever been on the Maine coast before? No. Don't you think it's beautiful? I do. Where are you going? I'm going to Monhegan Island. What are you going to do there? I'm going to be the guest of a writer. Have you ever written anything yourself? Yes. What did you write? The Soul's Sincere Desire. You know what impressed me most in that book was the golf illustration. And he warbled on and told me more about the book than I knew myself. And later on, when I was watching the sun go down and stars come out upon the upper deck, I saw this young man hurrying around, looking about hither and thither, and finally said, oh, there you are. Would you mind talking with me? I said, I'll be glad to. He said, I didn't mention your name because I couldn't think of it as Glenn Clark and Glenn Frank. I had been spoke at the University of Wisconsin once, and Glenn Frank said, when I was editor of the Century magazine, I got 17 letters telling me that The Soul's Sincere Desire was the best book I'd ever written. Well, I always felt complimented to be mixed up with the famous Glenn Frank, but he said, I'm a chaplain at Amherst College. I have to speak to the men once a week, and I don't know how to hold their attention. Can you help me? Oh, I ought to, I said. I've coached athletes for 20 years. I suppose you think your first duty is to make them good. Why, certainly, I'm a minister. That isn't your first duty. Well, what do you mean? Why, your first duty is to make yourself good. Oh, yes, he said, I know what you mean. But you can't make yourself good until you can't make them good. Your next job is to make them happy, but you can't make them permanently happy until you give them the basis of goodness on which you base your life. He said, that's exciting. Go on. And then he said, I said, what's your name? He said, my name's Kinsaving. I don't have a card. I said, I won't need a card. Because I can remember that name, because half the problems I have to solve are between kinfolk. Oh, I never have seen Kinsaving since. He did take me up the lapel of the coat, and he looked me in the eye, and he said, now I know why I'm here on the boat. I went down to the Old North Station to buy a ticket on the train, and an unseen hand pushed me through the station down to the wharf, and I've been wondering why I'm on this boat. Now I know. If you're ever near Amherst, let me know. I want you to speak to my boys. 2 years went by, and I was on another ship in the Maine coast in preparation for the rousing of attention to the Camps Farthest Out. I talked to 50 ministers and others in the morning, and then we had lunch together, and then I spoke to them in the afternoon. And at lunch opposite me sat a man who said, I'm chaplain of Dartmouth. Oh, you know young Kinsaving of Amherst, then? Oh, yes, he said, but he's not there anymore. He's in the Trinity Church, Boston. An old lady said, that's Phillips Brooks' old church. Wonderful, I said. I consider Phillips Brooks the greatest minister that ever lived. So he's an assistant pastor in that famous church. Oh, not assistant pastor, he's a head pastor. What? I said, how that church must have degenerated to have such a young man like that. No, she said it's grown since he's been there. And the chaplain said he's especially developed the power of drawing young people. The Wellesley girls call the bus that takes them to church on Sunday the Kinsaving Special. The editor of the Atlantic says it's become a byword in Boston. They never had anyone that could draw young people like young Kinsaving can. That's exactly what I prayed with him, that he'd have that gift. And the old lady said, yes, he even draws them from the Old South Church across the way. And the chaplain said, don't talk so loud. The pastor of the Old South Church is down the next table. Don't I know it? He's my son-in-law. I've often felt I could just write a story of my journeys. And it'd be more interesting than any book any novel I'd write. But I did put into this book, On the Wings of Prayer, the way God opened up things. One man in all Japan I wanted to meet. I didn't know where I could meet him. It was Captain Fushida, who led the attack of the great air squadron upon Pearl Harbor. I'd heard he'd become a Christian since the war. And when I was in Osaka at a businessman's luncheon, a prominent businessman, where Roland and I were to address them, a young man, a handsome man, sat down opposite me, and Marcia whispered, this man up here tells me that is Captain Fushida sitting right opposite you. I said, how did you happen to become a Christian? And now, out of all the world, that he come walking in and sit down right opposite me. The one man I wanted to see above all others. This has happened all over, as I shall tell a little about when I talk the morning we broadcast the world's prayer. But this was so startling that it took my breath away. He said, after that war, my conscience smote me when I saw that I was the one that really had been the instrument for starting that whole war between us, two nations. And I began to ask the returning soldiers who had been captured by the Filipinos and the Americans, how they'd been treated. And they said much better than we treated them. But especially those coming from the Philippines said there was a young woman over there that was just an angel. Positively, she was just out of this world and doing everything she could to make us happy. And we finally asked her why. She said, my father and mother were missionaries, and they were beheaded by your Japanese soldiers. They had been captured and taken as spies, and when they found they were to be executed, they asked to be left alone for a half an hour with their Bibles before they were beheaded. And she said, I know if they were alone with their Bibles, they were praying for their executioners. So I have decided to give my life now to save the souls of those who killed my parents. Why, said Fushida, we couldn't understand that in our religion. Anyone that had done that to our parents, we'd be blood enemies for life. There's something that happened that I couldn't understand, and I couldn't wait until I could get a copy of the Bible. You see, what she did was just the reverse of what they do in this world. You're in heaven when you do the reverse. An eye for an eye. No, she was a member of Jesus, very body and blood, as it were. Forgive your enemies. And he said, when I found there was a God of love, and when I read through that book of Luke and I saw Jesus hanging on the cross and saying, forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. He said the tears just rolled down my cheeks. And I went to the Christians and I said, I've got to be baptized as a Christian. And I'm going to give my life now to winning the Japanese to Christ. And I said, would you mind coming to the United States someday when I call you? And we could go together all over the nation, and you give your wonderful talk on no more Pearl Harbor, and I'll give my talk on no more World War. He said he would. And I'm not bringing him this year. I'm waiting till the wings of prayer gets. We're going to send it to all the senators and congressmen. We're going to wait until we get this thing built up, and then when he does come, I shall expect to go to cities where there'll be 8,000 people filling the hall in every city we go. And we're just going to sweep through this, bring this message, but we aren't ready until we've got thousands and thousands of folks trained in the camps farthest out and little prayer groups everywhere. Then when the right time comes, we can do those things. And why do I know it? Because the Lord arranged to have Fushida come in and sit right opposite me. He arranged to have him ask the question, why did this wonderful woman forgive her enemies? And when I rose to speak, I said, I've come all the way and I want to meet that man. And when Roland Brown got to speak, he said, I was present at the official baptism of that Rosemary. That was the name of the girl that was such an angel in the Philippines. She was a Baptist. I was one of those that officiated in the complete baptism of Rosemary. And so the whole thing fits together more fascinating than any novel you can write. I took a novel that I'd written to the Harpers and the story of my life, A Man's Reach. They said, the story of your life is so far more interesting than any novel you ever could make up. The moment you start living in the kingdom of heaven, expecting to be with the persons you want to be with, and that they want to be with you, expecting that the ideas will come in sequence and order, the right ones to bring happiness and comfort and joy to others, and that you won't need to worry about your supply. It won't come, you won't get bread enough for the whole year because you don't like to eat moldy bread anyway. You pray that Lord's Prayer that I learned how to pray with. Give us this day our nice, fresh, daily bread. And so I don't anticipate $1 million to finance all of our $1 billion for the next 20 years, but I do expect, just as we need them, the money to be coming in. Now it's going to cost $10,000 to send Roland Brown and Reverend Graves around the world, and they're opening everywhere. They're just going to have the greatest meetings they're just going to open all of Egypt and of all of Denmark. Why, the whole thing is, well, it costs $10,000. And I'd like to have another team. We're trying for one in South America. And then we could have another. And I see the time I could be sending 3 teams abroad. That costs $25,000. But the $10,000 came, and how did it come? Didn't ask anybody. But, I don't need to spend any money for myself. And these honorariums that come from these camps, wherever I speak, I just put it in the foundation farthest out, and there it is. And the money's already raised for him. That's not for the journey next year. And Bishop Dawson and his wife have just come back from South America. They called me, and they've never been to Camps Farthest Out. They've been to ashrams, but they said the missionaries in South America are just missionaries just begging for you to come down and open up Camps Farthest Out to the South America. You know what we're going to do someday? We're going to send Bernie Warfield on a team down through the Asia and all around through that area. He'll lead the singing and give some of the speeches, and that'll do a bigger knockout blow to the communists and say that we don't treat the dark races right, and I want to say they're partly right. But just to see a man like Bernie Warfield going along in a team like that will just silence them. Oh, we've got the folks, we've got the leaders, and all we need is the money, and I'm not worrying about that, because in the kingdom of heaven, when we need it, it's going to come. And when it comes in a big way, the 30,000 CFOers, every one of them will send in $10 a year, and there's just 300,000. With 300,000, we could make koinonia, run it, have 100,000 for food meals for the starving Indians, and 25,000 for scholarships for all the ministers who want to come to the camps. I'm still for that, and all the young divinity students. For the more we can reach the ministers, they're the ones that's going to save this nation, and not the generals, not West Point, but the theological seminaries, and they need a little boost. They need them after they've been there to come to a camp or something, learn how to pray, and then there's no telling what the churches will do. Well, let's close this. I'm surprised I can cover as much ground as I have in less than an hour, because this is a talk my wife used to about ideas. I was such a poor speaker that I didn't intend to make any speeches, but then I belonged to a Presbyterian college, and whenever a Presbyterian minister got sick, they'd phone in for a substitute, and the president said, "We don't have enough substitutes. You got to write a speech, a sermon, Mr. Clark." So I wrote one, a cup of cold water, the driest sermon ever preached, and never asked me to come back. But after a while, I found I couldn't even give it the first time, half the time, because just before I was getting ready to run and catch the train, my wife had come down sick. I figured after a while that was coincidence, happened too often. It was her little scheme to keep me from going away, so I had the doctor examine her very carefully, and he said, "Yes, she is sick. But if anyone ever heard you give that sermon, they'd know it'd be enough to make anybody sick just to think about it." So I roped it up in a mummy case. I'm glad I didn't destroy it, because it's one of those things that when I become famous someday, they will take it out and say, "There's the kind of a sermon that never should be preached." I put it so carefully away, and I went out and I said, "Now, Lord, you've got to do the talking through me." And my wife had come and hear me give this talk 100 times. It's always different, pulled out by the needs of the people out there. Yes, my mother took me to a dentist when I was a boy. He's very good, and every filling he put in remained there to this day. But she took me to hear a minister on Sunday who didn't like boys, and his sermons came rolling out as fast as he rolled them in. Now, the difference between those two was that the minister didn't give a snap of his finger for the needs of my little boy's heart, but the dentist let the flow of his gold be governed by the cavities of my little boy's teeth. So I came here tonight. A lot of people have heard me give this talk. So I said, "Lord, what'll I do? Louise, you can help me more when I'm in that mixture. That's a new one. I want them to know how to live in the kingdom." And he said, "All right, tell them about that to Ben Johnson. Put in some of these new things." I have found, when I come here, I ask the Lord not to give a famous speech, a marvelous oration, but that he would have the needs in your heart pull out of me just the things that you needed. And I found that's the best recipe to give a good talk there is. Because the form and the needs in your heart carve out beautiful frames of some kind, molds. You know, if I could find a mold that Michelangelo had made for some great angel, and nobody knew it was his mold, I discovered it. And I could put Pastor Paris in there, and I could bring out morals. I could put my name on that. I could be the most, that famous thing. Well, you know, that book, A Soul Sincere Desires, is so wonderful. I mean, people said it was so wonderful. I want to say this. I don't deserve credit for it. A boy with a great need said, "How do you pray?" And I poured this into his heart. I tried to fill it in, and his need was so beautiful that it came out in beautiful forms. You come with some beautiful cravings to learn more about God, and I can pour it into your heart, and the speech is a good speech. And I don't have to plan it or organize it or anything else, but you have to take that 15 minutes every day to get in tune. Why, first year I got the flu, was sick in bed for a week. I heard a man ring the doorbell, and my little 6-year-old boy opened it, and a voice down there said, "Well, the little man, does Glenn Clark live here?" "Yes, sir." "Dr. Glenn Clark, who wrote The Soul Sincere Desire?" "Yes, sir." "Well, I've got a little rheumatism in my left knee. I wonder if you'll pray for me." "Oh, sure. Dad'd be glad to pray for you. He's sick in bed. You go up and he'll pray for you." After a while, I said, "This would be ridiculous, Father, if it wasn't so funny. But what's the big idea?" And just as plainly as if he'd come into the room, he said, "Don't you realize that after you've been in bed for a week, you 3 times as spiritual as before, because you've had 24 hours a day to turn to me?" And I said, "Well, I catch the hint. You mean I should take more time every day to tune in?" He said, "Sure." So I quit taking the morning paper, didn't take it again for 12 years. I took a whole hour the first year to getting in tune. After that, it only took me 15 minutes. Sometimes I wake in the kingdom in the morning, and I don't even have to go into it. But if I woke out of the bed on the wrong side in the morning, I'd phone my business. If I was a businessman, I won't come down until 11 o'clock. I get back in bed, and if I still got off on the wrong side, I said I won't be down until 3 o'clock. Remember how Peter fished all night on the wrong side and didn't catch anything? Might just as well quit your fishing, quit everything else. Why, if all our businessmen before 1929 had gone to bed and stayed in bed until they could get out on the right side, we wouldn't have had a crash in 1925. If President Roosevelt had had a spiritual trust as well as a brain trust, I asked him to have a spiritual trust, and I got it through some hands that got it right to him. His wife wrote me a nice letter. He refused the absurdity of having a prayer trust. If he'd had a prayer trust, he could have kept us out of he could have prevented the Second World War, and I have absolute proof, and nobody's ever denied it. He could have saved the lives of 300,000 of our boys, as well as 50 million other folks. I consider that practical. So is the spiritual trust, very practical. It would have saved us the cost of $300 billion. I say $300 billion is rather practical. Oh, I want to just say the most practical thing in the world is just that little tuning in. And so when you tune in, then what happens? Then you can do what you feel led to do. It so happened that one year I was trying to write the Soul Sincere Desire. I wanted to write something else. And I found on Thursday mornings I didn't have any class till 11:30. So I thought if I didn't go to chapel at 10 o'clock chapel, I'd have all that block of time. But one morning I woke and every bone in my body just yearned to go to chapel. Every nerve just shrank from sitting down to the right. I felt like I was running away from my duty, but I said, when I'm in tune, I feel I can do the thing I feel led to do. And not only do I feel led, but I just feel like I'm being catapulted to the chapel. So I went to the chapel. As I walked in, the dean was announcing that a car with 4 students in it had gone over a cliff, turned turtle 4 times, and little Margaret would not live through the day. As I walked out, I asked the professor if that Margaret was the little freshman girl I knew, and he said yes. That year, the students had asked if they could come down to my house once a week and let me talk to them on living in the kingdom. They said, if you come down at 7:15 and don't leave until 7:45. Is this working all right? Yes. It won't interfere with your activities or my activities, your studies. That'll be all right. They came by about a dozen the first time, then about 20, and then 60 and 70. They just filled the floor, festooned the window seats and the stairs, and after they would go home in silence back to their dormitories. My wife said our football team came. They'd never won a championship. They were just a mediocre team. I didn't talk about winning games. I just talked about being in the right place at the right time and all that, by living in the kingdom. And they surprised the state by winning the state championship. And they said we were always in the right time to cast the forward passes. We can't explain it. We just don't know what it was. We're just a mediocre team. But my wife said there's a little freshman girl named Margaret that has a wistful look. I wish that you'd talk with her sometime. I went in to see a professor in his classroom once, and the class was arriving. He hadn't come, but Margaret was standing by his desk. I went up and I talked with her. I found she was the only daughter of a widowed mother. She had one brother. She wrote him every day. And I said, I wish that I'd like to have a talk with you someday. Oh, I want to. I'm coming to see you soon. And now she was never coming. As I went out the chapel door, I saw a boy hurrying to catch the streetcar. I said, George, are you going down to the hospital? Yes. Is it on the street railway? Is it on the electrical line? No, it's way off. It'll be a long walk at the other end. But just wait a minute. I have a little touring car. I have a battery put in storage for the winter. I just had it put back yesterday. You wait, and I'll go take you down. We found the president and his wife and 8 members of the faculty standing in the hall waiting for the little girl to die. George took me to the room where the unconscious figure was, and he introduced me to the mother who'd come down during the night from her town. He put his arm around her and took her out, and then he closed the door and left me alone. The door opened, 2 physicians came in. They began to examine her hands and her feet. Do you think she'll live? No. When they picked her up, they had no heartbeat, no blood pressure, no breathing. We're going to examine her now, irritating her soles and her palms to see if there's any response, whether she'll be paralyzed in her life if she does live. I stood there by the bed, and they paid no attention to me. There's a table beside the bed, and on the table was a vase of flowers. I thought if that vase of flowers should fall crashing to the floor, and they took a moving picture of it, that'd be on this earth plane. But if they turned it in the reverse, we'd see the fragments drawn up into a hole. Isn't that exactly what Jesus came for? To make men whole. Stalin and all of our armies and our atomic bombs are to smash people into fragments and cities into fragments. But if we let the Lord turn it, he'd just be the opposite. He'd draw the fragments up into holes. I said, I've got the vision I want. But I'd stood there a long time in prayer. Didn't realize how much time had gone by. When I went out, I found George had gone. I got my little Ford, rode back, and threw my hat down my office and went to my classroom. And on the stairs, I saw by the clock that I was 15 minutes late. And no class had ever been known to wait for a professor after the first 10 minutes at McAllister. I had a class, it was the last class of the year, and my heart sank. I wanted to be with those boys and girls. I had the book in that room I had to get, so I walked on in. I was in the very center of the room before I became aware of the fact that the silence of that room is not a silence of emptiness, but a silence of prayer. Every boy and every girl was sitting in his seat. One of the boys softly closed the door, and one of the girls said, they told us where you went. I went behind my desk and I said, I think that little girl is going to be with us next year. I said, I've gone through an experience this morning that has taken away all my urge to give any more teaching about the grammar and rhetoric. Here's a creative writing class, and I'm going to tell you something. If you ever want to become a famous writer, a worthwhile writer, you're not going to do it by following the little secondary laws of grammar and rhetoric. Not until you obey the great primary laws of opening one ear to the voice of God and putting the other down to the heartbeats of mankind will you ever write anything worthwhile. Well, Abraham Lincoln never went through the first grade. He couldn't have qualified to come to McAllister. But when he went to Gettysburg, he didn't look up any laws of grammar and rhetoric. He put his ear down to the heartbeats of those folks coming to hear him. And he opened up the other ear to the voice of God, and he said, I can't hallow and I cannot dedicate this ground. The fathers and the mothers of those boys who fought and some of them died here, they and their boys are the ones that should hallow and dedicate this ground.